too long didn't watch my Jedi Survivor review is that while I liked the story and the setting, its gameplay made it a frustrating experience. Even after 8 months of patches, I still have multiple bugs and technical problems. The characters were a highlight to me, with their models and voice actors amongst the best I've played. But the combat felt loose and unfair at times. Rather than the get-good mentality of Dark Souls that clearly influenced Survivor, I found that Respawn took the wrong lessons from that series. I never once felt like a powerful Jedi, like I did in Force Unleashed. But rather, each combat encounter felt like a roll of the dice, especially when fighting many of the beasts and creatures in the game. Traversal sections are too long, convoluted, and often confusing. Each new area felt like a slog to get through, with Cal having to do the same things each time to progress, rather than having Traversal shake things up in that routine. Survivor felt short as well, with the main storyline only taking 15 hours to complete. And while Respawn made several of the worlds incredibly massive, making exploration an important feature of the game, the cost was that only 2 of those worlds are truly open and vast. As it stands right now, I would not recommend Jedi Survivor unless you absolutely loved Fallen Order and the story of Cal Kestis. Also, please just don't play it on PC, as the performance is still reportedly very terrible.
Long way down. We've come so far.
Let's go on to technical performance. This section is going to be pretty rough. Survivor released 8 months previous to the writing of this review, and it's still pretty unpolished, even on consoles. I played on Xbox Series X, and I did it on the performance mode, which targets 60 FPS, and the quality mode, which tried to get 30 FPS with ray tracing and enhanced visuals. Performance mode I found blurred at times, with textures popping in on some of the bigger planets and settlements. Quality mode FPS gets to about 30 at times, but if there's a lot of action or you're in one of the main towns, it does dip below that. For the extra visuals and ray tracing, I found it not to be worth it, especially when I didn't really notice a difference between the 2 modes visually. Climbing is janky. Not in how it works, but just how it feels. I would often jump towards a section I was clearly meant to use, and the game just wouldn't register it. I would need to try it again, and then it would work. Also, I would just get stuck on objects while climbing multiple times, requiring me to load the game again. Combat has its fair share of jank as well. Enemies would get stuck on things, they would jump out of reach, they would stay there and just not engage, but I couldn't progress the story because you can't do that as long as you're in combat. Once when I was in a battle with a large monster, we both just started flying above the level. And then when it died, it stayed in the air and I dropped onto the ground. Characters would also just teleport onto and off of the ship, the Mantis. Then when we would go to take off, like I would go to the navigation screen, select a new planet we were supposed to take off, the characters would T-pose for a little while, then they would get into their seats, then the ship would take off. I had weird artifacts on the bottom of my screen my entire playthrough, only during cinematics, and they just didn't go away even after reloading. The game crashed for me multiple times to the Xbox home screen. It deleted most of the footage that I took of the game and saved on the internal hard drive for an entire day. So that wiped out that entire day, the early sections of the game. That's gone. An enemy fired a flare-like item at me in one of the later game missions, and that flare stuck to my character even after I died, even after the cinematics played, even after the mission ended. Even when I changed clothing, that flare was still there. I had to reload the game, and thankfully it stopped. But I just couldn't do it at that time because I would lose that progression. Graphically, game looks great. There are times when it even looks stunning, even on performance mode. There's a swamp section that looks really good. There's a top of a mountain base that's towards the middle of the game that looks really, really nice. Coruscant, even though Coruscant is just a small little, almost scripted section kind of thing, that looked great. Character models are the real standout. Whatever motion capture they did in this game, very, very good. There's multiple celebrities, and you can tell, like Master Cordova, I've seen him in multiple projects before. You can easily tell who he is, the actor. There's performance issues even after 8 months of patches. In my opinion, I doubt Jedi Survivor is ever going to be in a place where it would be quote unquote perfect. I think it's what you get now is pretty much what you're going to get, especially on console, which is where I've reviewed it. I've heard terrible things about the PC port. Just stay clear of the PC port. Quality mode, as I've said in my earlier part of my review, quality mode is just not worth it for the negligible improvements to graphics. Stick to performance mode. This is the type of game where you need to respond quickly to in combat and traversal, and if you're not in performance mode, the FPS will drop too low, and it'll result in needless deaths. Story and setting. The story is good, but I do wish that they would explore time periods outside of the Empire. I understand why they stick to the Empire. It makes sense to me. You have a big bad guy, you have the good guys, it's very cut and dry and clean. The problem with setting it in that time period of the Empire is as you add more and more of the lore and the content and all these other things, it takes away from what you already had existing. For example, Luke is supposed to be one of the only Jedis. Luke, Obi-Wan, and Yoda. Okay, well now that you have Cal, and you have Seer, and you have Master Cordova, and you have Marin, and you have a bunch of other people, and now there's Jedi everywhere, and and then there's the Inquisitors, who are also like either fallen Jedi or evil people turned into Jedi. It takes away from that experience. The story itself seems like it's missing something. It begins with a heist gone wrong, and then the Mantis needs to go get repairs. So he goes to a planet where one of his friends has settled. It leads him to finding a trapped droid, which tells of a planet that's hidden in this array. He finds a access key, and he releases somebody from their imprisonment. I'm not going to give any spoilers, but he releases somebody from the imprisonment and leads to the events of the entire game. The issue with that is it seems very, very random. Like he just randomly went to this place because he needed repairs. He just happened to find this droid. He just happened to release this Jedi who just happened to lead him onto the next thing and the next thing. Just seems weird. The Empire are also there for no real reason aside from the fact that they're the bad people. So they would just randomly show up. Especially an iconic character just shows up for no reason because, they're hunting Jedi. The major problem I had with the setting is where do I go? What am I supposed to do? It's one of those games. They give you a map. The map is terrible. They give you a pointer on the map, like a point of interest to go to, with no real path of how to get there. So it's a very Metroid style of gameplay where you have a map marker in the distance. You can't see it on your main screen. You can only see it on the map. You need to get there. Figure it out. The problem with that is there's a lot of... it's an open world game. I don't ask for hand holding, but if you're going to have a map marker, lead me there. I just found that I didn't know. There was often times I would just sit there for 10, 15, 20 minutes trying to figure out where I'm supposed to go. Gameplay is where I found Jedi Survivor to be the most frustrating. There are basically 3 main things to do in this game. There's combat, there's traversal puzzles, and there's cinematics. I call it traversal puzzles because it's not just straightforward traversal of walk here or climb this or get to this point. There's a puzzle in that. So it's never just a straightforward climb. There's always things to do in there. So the problem is if you're not feeling one of those parts, the traversal or the combat, it never gets any better. There's nothing ever changed. So if you play the first hour or 2 hours of the game and it just doesn't click, don't expect it to fix that over the next 10 or 15 hours. What it is what it is. It's always going to be in the same format of short corridor, followed by a traversal puzzle, followed by short combat. And then sometimes they'll switch the order of that. So sometimes it is a short corridor, combat, traversal puzzle, or combat, short corridor, traversal puzzle. But it's never anything besides those. It's always in an order. Traversal puzzles are only ever broken up by combat. That's it. So once you see enemies in the distance and you know that's where you're going, you know that instance of traversal is going to be over as soon as you've reached those enemies. And then once those 3 or 4 or 5 people are dead, you know that it's just going to be either a little corridor onto the next section, or you're going to have to climb somewhere else afterwards. Let's talk about combat. It is not very tight, as in it doesn't flow, the controls aren't super responsive. It's not Dark Souls. It can be incredibly janky at times. It's clearly inspired by Dark Souls and Bloodborne, but it's not at the same level of those. You have 5 stances to choose from with your lightsabers, and there's different stats and abilities for each one of those stances. The problem comes with there's no attack canceling. So only for dual wield do you have attack canceling, meaning if you have an animation where you're locked into a swing. So for example, the cross guard is one of the stances you can get. It's a slow, heavy swing. Once you press the attack button, you're locked into that. So if you need to dodge or block or anything like that, unless you're using the dual wield, you can't do any of that stuff. Even the dual wield, which states clearly that you can cancel out of it and block, I never truly felt like it could. It always felt really loose with that. One of the things that makes Jedi Survivor totally different than Dark Souls is there's no roll. So if you press on the Xbox, it's the B button. If you press the B button, you do a short little side step or a little dodge, no roll. So there's no like long roll with iframes, there's no invincibility for your rolling. You're getting attacked by a long distance enemy. How do you get there quickly? In Dark Souls, you would just roll towards them or run towards them quickly, but you don't have that in this. So you try to use your force pull, because okay, that's an ability I have. I'll just pull them towards me and I'll attack them. That doesn't really work because most of these enemies are resistant to force powers a lot of the times. I found force powers in Jedi Survivor are very, very weak. Most of the enemies, it doesn't affect them at all. You have to catch them off guard. And the ones that it does affect are so weak anyway, they're usually, you hit them once with a lightsaber, they die regardless. Fights are very short. Rarely is there any waves of enemies. Towards the end of the game, it starts getting more like that, but usually it's a handful of enemies that you see after a traversal section, and you'll notice them right away. There will be 3 or 4 or 5. Once they're dead, that's it. So it's very short. Combat is also interrupted by cinematics far too often. It's like you're fighting, and then they just take the control away from you for 10-15 seconds during the cinematic, and then hand it back to you. Bosses do this all the time. Each boss will have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 cinematics that break up the combat. What ends up happening is you get into a flow, you start learning their movements, and then a cinematic hits, and you're kind of interrupted, you lose that flow state. They give control back to you, and in that brief time where the cinematic ends and you get control, the enemy has better reaction than you, so they usually get a free hit on you. Those cinematics are skippable, but you still have to enter them. Enemy moves aren't telegraphed very well. I was listening to the development of the Dark Souls series and how their approach to combat. There's a reason that your character is smaller than the enemies you fight. Part of it is to just give a sense that you're weaker than them, so like you're against the odds kind of thing. But it's also so that you can see their movements very clearly. So if you play a Dark Souls game, if you fight a humanoid character, when they go to swing their weapon, they make it very obvious that they swing their weapon. They'll hold their arm way back, they'll take a second, there's enough time there for you to recognize that that's an attack. I find with Jedi Survivor, it doesn't have that. The enemies that you do fight that are similar size to you don't telegraph their movements in that same kind of way, making it hard to parry. The answer to that, which is like, say, the Arkham Asylum games or other games where they have a humanoid person fighting another humanoid-sized person, is a parry marker, like a press Y button at this time, like a yellow flash or a yellow button. Sometimes people give them grief about that. They're like, well, that's not, that's very gamey. But there's a reason you do that, so you can recognize that an attack is coming. So, for example, in Jedi Survivor, you're surrounded by enemies that don't telegraph their attacks very well. Oftentimes, they're in the shadow or or blocked by the camera, so you can't really see them. So there's these attacks surrounding you and attacking you on all sides, and you just don't know that they're coming, or you don't have time to respond to them because you're in an uninterruptible attack with your lightsaber, or you just don't see them because it's dark, or they're on the back side of you or on the back of the camera. Then you have long-range attacks coming from nowhere that strike you. It doesn't flow correctly. The combat, I just did not enjoy the combat. The second part, and this is the part you'll be using the most in this game, is traversal puzzles. Traversal is a puzzle in this game. This isn't like, for example, Uncharted, where you'll have to climb a cliff or a building or anything like that, and it's a scripted event, like very choreographed. If you're not fighting in this game, you're traversing something. And I don't just mean walking up a hill or walking down a path. Traversal is running on walls, it's jumping, it's climbing on things, it's opening up ways to get to another place. It is very frequent. It's 90% of this game, and it's very janky. Sometimes I just wouldn't latch onto something that I was clearly supposed to climb. I also never knew if I was going the right way or if I was supposed to climb on stuff, since there's a time when I could skip entire sections due to poor design. Like I could just skip an area by double jumping in and boosting, even though I knew that I wasn't supposed to do that. I could just get there. But then there's other times when I was supposed to double jump and boost, but I'm not really understanding that because it's not highlighted in a way that other games do. Like, okay, let's go back to Uncharted. A lot of times in Uncharted or Last of Us or Tomb Raider, you would mark out where you're supposed to climb with the yellow paint or like some kind of fluorescence. And yes, it's very video gamey, but then you can clearly recognize immediately where you're supposed to climb. Jedi Survivor doesn't do that. Jedi Survivor just says, hey, there's this gray grate over in the distance. Maybe you can climb on it, but I've also seen gray grates that I couldn't climb on. Every stair you run into is broken, every door is closed, every lift just doesn't work, because those are all shortcuts back to this meditation point, which is a Dark Souls bonfire. And then the third part of this game is cinematics. Cinematics look great, they happen way too often, and often at the worst times. Microtransactions. It's an EA game without microtransactions. It's unheard of, especially with the amount of cosmetics in this game. So you can customize Cal's look, his lightsaber, his blaster, BD1, your clothing, your hair, your beard, all that good stuff. You can change the colors and the look of it. I feel that this game came out too early with all of its performance issues on launch. Not just the PC port, which I've said is bad, but just the console as well, and the gameplay design. If they didn't playtest the optimization for performance mode and quality mode and all that stuff, and these bugs that I'm finding, do you really think they did for the gameplay as well? So the traversal sections, the combat, and all that stuff. If they didn't do the polishing for the visuals, what's the chances they did the polishing for the gameplay? I feel that a lot of people are going to love this game, either because it's, a Star Wars game, or they're going to love their gameplay, and that's absolutely great. People should love video games, and if you're happy with Jedi Survivor, I'm absolutely thrilled for you. It's just that I didn't like the game, and I can hope that Respawn does better with the next one. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe for future content.